what I want to amplify right now for all the hip hop heads that are here is two things. One, House of Paint is doing some great work. So give it up for House of Paint, and they've been doing it for almost 2 decades now. So shout out to House of Paint for having these kinds of things, but also shout out to Shad for the Peabody Award. Thank you. I don't know if people, we're not all in journalism. Most of us are not professional journalists, but winning a Peabody is a lifetime achievement kind of award for a journalist. And so shout out to you for doing that with Hip Hop Evolution. And I think what's most important, or for me, what is critical is the way that it was celebrated in Canada. I want to talk a little bit about how you cultivated some of your take on hip hop culture from an interviewer's perspective. I mean, you're an active artist, and you've been around artists like Curtis Blow. You've been around some legends, and I'm wondering how you made that transition from performing artist to award-winning journalist. But most importantly, I love how all of the news outlets covered it with these headline stories, except for one news outlet. I won't name that news outlet, but there's one news outlet that didn't want to give you your props. But I want us to give you your props right now on that piece. So yeah, congratulations, brother.
I appreciate that, Mark. And it's great to be in conversation with you. I've been looking forward to this. As far as the role of interviewing with Hip Hop Evolution, this is how I saw it. I saw my job as, so I saw the show fundamentally as the pioneers themselves telling the story, first of all, right? And so I felt like my job as the interviewer was to help the guest get back to those seminal moments. Because the thing that happens with all of us is, first of all, memory is a tricky thing. It's difficult to go back for some of these people 30 years, 40 years, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that happens with all of us is we don't find our own stories that amazing sometimes, our own life that amazing. So it sometimes requires a partner in conversation to reflect back the significance. Yeah. And so I really felt like that was part of my role. Like let's take, for example, someone like Ice-T, okay? Like he's a pro, he was easy to interview, but somebody like him, Russell Simmons, was a little bit harder, okay? He obviously had a role in starting Def Jam. He's super, super important, but he's moved on to so many things in his career that it's hard for him sometimes to go back and tell the story of Def Jam. It takes a partner in conversation, I think, that is, first of all, like informed enough to engage, and secondly, enthusiastic about that time in their life. And then suddenly they can go, oh yeah, that was kind of amazing. We did this. And then the memories start to flood back. So I really thought that was a big part of my role in the show. Yeah. And then just basically helping them come alive as storytellers.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like they received you differently because they knew you were a performing artist, or did they know that part of your life?
We would always tell them, you're talking to somebody who is a performer themselves. They're an artist themselves, they're a rapper, so they understand. But we didn't make that a big emphasis, just enough to say, I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because when someone doesn't understand what you're talking about, you're going to skim over the details. You're going to talk in generalities. But when someone knows what you're talking about, then you can go more into detail, and that's what we wanted, right? So, yeah. So we told them that just by way of saying this person's going to understand what you're talking about.
Yeah. Did you find that in the interviews you could, when you dug deeper, then you got more out of them? Like you could relate to aspects of being in the studio or being on stage and having to improvise, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there were moments definitely where I would try to demonstrate that, like, I'm following your story. I know what that's like. And so then I just felt like it allowed them to go deeper in their memory and really get granular, right? Because that's what makes it come alive, I feel like, is the people that were really there telling the story and getting into that level of detail and coming alive as storytellers, right? Like the rappers we're talking to and the DJs are storytellers.
Yeah.
It's what it is fundamentally. So to awaken that side of them was really what I felt my job was.
Okay. Now, did you get, I want to know, when you got in the room with some of these legends, was it like being on stage? Were you butterflies and
butterflies every time? And in the exact same way as being on stage, I felt like if you don't have butterflies, it's a bad sign.
Yeah.
It's a sign you're not really respecting what you're doing. Yeah. Nice. So right on to the last interview, like there were nerves. I'm trying to think of who the last interview was, but yeah. Okay. I think we were in New Orleans at that point, but right up to that point.
Yeah. So what were some of the things you feel like you learned from having to be out on the road? You know, all of the cities that you guys went to, you have a team of researchers, you have all this information about different cities that you're going to, like Memphis and Houston and New Orleans.
Yeah. Well,
it's clear that you learned about those areas.
Yeah.
But what did you learn about hip hop in Canada, or just the process of documenting the culture?
So I learned a couple things that really stand out for me. One, I learned that hip hop, the story of hip hop is the story of technology in a way that I didn't recognize before, because I came into hip hop through rapping and I really focused on words and language and all that. And I really came to appreciate that this is electronic music. This is DJ. This started with the DJ and the turntables and sampling machines, drum machines, and it evolved like that. Mm-hmm. As like the same way that it evolved geographically and like with mixing with different local cultures, it evolved also because of technology. So I gained a deeper appreciation for that. And I learned a lot about these different cities, and what it taught me about hip hop in Canada is that Canada, and Toronto specifically, has a longer hip hop history and a deeper hip hop history than we give it credit for. So I learned this because going to places like Miami, Atlanta, they didn't really care for hip hop for a long time. It was not their, New Orleans, it was not their culture, right? Whereas Toronto has a lot of the same ingredients as New York, because hip hop's New York culture basically, right? But Toronto has so many of the same ingredients, namely Jamaican diaspora and Jamaican musical culture mixed with North American musical culture. Yeah. That was happening, Kool Herc. You know, that was happening in Toronto at virtually the same time because of this, which you could speak to better than me. You know, this African, this Black, you know, I don't know if you call it triangle but, you know, the Caribbean and North America and the UK, you know, this conversation, this transatlantic Black musical conversation. And I would actually love to hear from you about this, because we didn't get to dig into Toronto hip hop history. This was just the sense I got, you know, from going to places like Atlanta and hearing them be like, oh yeah, there was basically no rappers here, you know, until the late 80s. We didn't care for that. But I'm sure you've discovered that Toronto has a much longer, deeper hip hop history.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, in the middle of the 80s, you know, lots of the kids from the Caribbean diaspora, they were on stage and they were performing. And, you know, in some of the work I do in Northside, I get to just sit with some of these early performers and artists and hip hop heads and just listen and learn of their stories. And, you know, 80, 84, 85, when people are getting on stage, they're not even imagining that they should record anything. They're not, like, it's not about industry. It's about getting up and having fun, being young, playing with oral culture, which, you know, isn't just, you know, Jamaican, but lots of early MCs in Toronto were Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, and it comes back to just having oral culture as part of the entire African diaspora. So, I mean, there's the piece around technology, though. You know, I also learned when the SP1200 came to Toronto and Scott LaRock came and he taught Rumble, and it's so interesting how these diasporic roots, where, you know, many people have relatives in New York. For some reason, hip hop followed those roots to Ottawa, to Winnipeg, to Toronto, to Montreal, as you know, as the family goes in the car for the long road trip to see cousins and whatever. And it was so interesting that, you know, Toronto, because we had such a large number of young people, young Afro-Caribbean people, the audiences were there. And, you know, and if you listen to other stories, mainstream stories, you would think that we didn't have hip hop until Maestro Fresh West cut an album, kind of thing, or Michi Mean cut an album, when really there was a massive ecosystem of lots of women DJs, lots of nightclub spaces that are Black owned nightclubs, you know, and that are happening by the early 80s, mid 80s. But I think the most important thing that I learned coming back to technology is just the sound system, and how the sound system migrated, so that you would have sound systems in Toronto that didn't have Jamaican origins, but they would be involved in setting up the speakers and setting up the party, and maybe playing calypso or playing something else. So shout out to Winston. But and Maceo Sound, some of these sound systems were inventing something new with parts and pieces from other places in the diaspora, you know, and that's what I hope hip hop heads would learn from the Canadian context. But in terms of your audience, you have a much wider audience with Hip Hop Evolution. If there was something you would want hip hop heads specifically to learn from your travels and from your experiences, what would that be? Something that, like, not the average audience member that's, oh yeah, I like rap music, like, you know, the nerd that would tell you how many seconds you could record on an SP1200 in 1984 kind of thing.
Yeah. What I hope people take away is like, the series is a celebration, right? It's a celebration of the creativity. But it's a celebration of the creativity on many levels. And that's why I try to highlight the technological side, right? Because it's not just artistic genius, it's also mechanical, technical genius, right? Because of what was happening with these machines. It was just a frontier of music technology at every turn. Hip hop was at the frontier.
Yeah.
Right. So I hope they take that away from the series. And then the beauty of all these different local Black cultures, right? That are all a little bit different. Yeah. But then they have these shared elements. I love hearing all this stuff about Toronto hip hop. I really hope that gets its moment, you know, on screen too. And it is so interesting when you talk about the early times too. You brought up the sound systems. It's like the sounds talk about the 70s, they didn't necessarily have the words hip hop, right? So if you talk about, when I've talked to a few people that were in Toronto in the 70s, they're like, oh yeah, you mean them block parties? Like, they were really doing the same thing. It's just they had, like you were sort of alluding to, they just had different language for it, or the style was a little bit different because the community was a little bit different.
Yeah.
But
the Blocko was a major thing. Like, the Blocko was the jam before it was called a jam. So some of the best memories people will give you, they'll be talking about Blockos, and, you know, there's barbecue and there's food, and you know, some of the stories that you'll hear is like the police would come and be partying at the Blocko, and it was that kind of family fun, kind of everyone's dancing, everyone's eating, etc. And it's probably a lot of funk music playing back then in those times, you know, but it's the same kind of vibe, right?
Exactly. And I loved what you said too about who was it that taught. Who was it that brought the SP to Toronto?
Scott LaRock.
Scott LaRock. Like,
yeah, this is what I was told by Rumble, and he was the one that he taught him how to use it. So that machine may not have even been for sale in somewhere like Toronto.
I think the more we get into the modern era of production with laptops, the more we lose track of how hard it was back then. And not just how hard it was, but just the way that the music evolved.
Yeah.
It was really hand to hand and person to person. And, you know, we have a beat in our series about how the SP was taught in New York, from Paul C to Large Professor to Pete Rock and down the line. Like, it was really person to person.
Yeah.
Because it was so the frontier.
That's what I love about it, is that I feel like you capture, when you talk about focusing on technology, you capture, I don't want to say an essence, but you capture a really salient and important point, that the creativity in hip hop was also extended onto the technologies. It wasn't, the turntable was never made to be an instrument. Hip hoppers made it an instrument.
Yeah.
It's now an instrument, you know?
A 13-year-old Grandmaster Flash.
Yeah.
Went deep into that machine and figured out what else it could do. You know, and he told us a story about how his mom was a seamstress, so he knew about different materials, and felt was the best material for the slip mat, and like all these things, you know. And crazy. So yeah, absolutely.
And he went to school for electronics, which gave him, you know, it's actually when you look at the similarities between him and someone like King Tubby, who was building amplifiers during Jamaican dub music, there's a certain kind of genius there that can't be captured, you know, because there really isn't a metric or a precedent for how someone would, you know, manually invent reverb. You know, this is what King Tubby manually invented reverb. I teach this to my students, and it blows my mind today, because, you know, we're still trying to figure out what button to press on the computer to get reverb. And, you know, 40 years ago, someone invented it, you know, in their home studio kind of thing.
Yes. Yes.
So, you know, this makes me think about the myth of digital platforms. And I do a lot of archiving work and read about archiving and study archiving, try to figure out how to preserve things, especially as technology changes rapidly. I would love to hear from you your experience with MySpace, because I recently went back to MySpace and I found some photos that we were taking before our cell phones had photos, you know, had cameras, and I couldn't get them off of MySpace. I was very upset about that. They won't let you copy the photo off of, you have to do a screenshot. But what was it like when you started out as an artist?
Yeah, so when I started out as an artist, it was CDs and MySpace and a bit of iTunes, and what else were the means? Ringtones were like a year away.
Yeah.
YouTube didn't exist yet. Facebook was just for college kids to message each other, so that wasn't a platform. So of course, Instagram, Twitter, none of that stuff existed. So the music industry was CDs, it was still physical copies, and it was MySpace. But MySpace was not really part of the music industry yet. So I remember Gnarls Barkley's Crazy was the first song to go to #1, basically from the internet, from MySpace. It blew up on MySpace. So I say that to demonstrate how, like, at that point, the music industry still didn't want to really consider anything that wasn't physical copies. They were still fighting it. It was still just post Napster, where their approach was fighting the digital landscape, right? Yeah. So what I remember of that time, in terms of my career, was that was a huge, huge way to share your music to a community that was interested in independent music. I remember they had their own little charts at a certain point, and I was somewhere in there, but way at the top was this guy called Drake that I hadn't heard of before, but, you know, he was already showing his savvy with the new landscape, you know, like he was huge there. Yeah. Belly was big there. But there's like you said, there's no recollection of that anymore.
Yeah.
There's no archive of what was happening, who was popular, nothing of that little micro era.
Is that everything you're saying, you could never find that again. You couldn't find those charts. And depending on, MySpace hasn't dissolved yet, but when they do dissolve, all of that stuff will disappear. Yeah. So I feel for artists, and even for my whole crew on my radio show, we have people, we have photos from our radio show and all that we can't get down. And it leads me to distrust these platforms, because new ones pop up all the time and they have no obligation to us at all. in terms of knowing that they are a main organ or platform to distribute music for artists or painters or, you know, any other people that are using these platforms. They, you know, and it became very, very clear during the first couple months of the pandemic when a bunch of DJs started live streaming on Instagram, and they would just cut people off. They would shut people down. You know, Tory Lanez was doing his thing early on, and he, you know, he was having thousands of people in there, and you know, Instagram was had no concern for what was going on these platforms.
Yeah.
The other scary thing is that in the early 2000s, I don't know if you remember, were you listening to podcasts in like when they were only on iPods in like 2001 or something like that?
No, not yet.
So I told the guys on my radio show, yo, we got a podcast. We got to do this thing. It's like 2001, 2002. We set up a Podomatic account. And apparently the majority of the podcasts that went up in the 2000s are nowhere to be found now online. So of course, all of these blogs and these different platforms have disappeared, but there's no record of the content that was there.
Yeah. Yeah, look, like I find this fascinating. So our show ends around 2005, mid 2000s. And a part of me is grateful for that because I feel like it's really hard to talk about the early 2000s and the mid 2000s because of everything that has disappeared in the digital space. What's the hardest era that you feel like to art in terms of your archives?
I mean, the early 2000s, definitely, because a lot of us just didn't know what was going on, with peer-to-peer, Napster, all these FTP platforms. So a lot of that stuff disappeared. And there seems to be, when there were hard copies, there were a couple people that were, that kept these copies of flyers and posters and whatnot. So like, you know, I think of someone like Carlito, who was an artist, won a Juno back in the 90s for Move Your Body. He, you know, he had all of his flyers from all of the Monster Jams.
Wow.
All of the Lessons events, hard copies. He came into the exhibition in a little manila folder and just opened it, and it was like gold to me. And I wonder at this moment if, you know, if you were starting a career in 2000, if you would just assume that YouTube is an archive, digital platforms will archive all this stuff for me. I don't need to do all that work. You know, so I'm concerned. I'm like, you know, for most of Northside stuff, we don't archive many things beyond 2010, you know, just capacity. And when I go back and I try to even get my own podcasts down from 2000, a lot of them are gone. A lot of Blogspot, I think, is now no longer. And, you know, it's just a different landscape, and these companies come and go, you know.
And yeah, that blog landscape was also super important to the scene while it was, you know, going. One interesting quirk I want to ask you about, quirk of Canadian hip hop specifically, is this thing of the much fat grants and how much of the important music was only on video. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a bit about that? I think that, like, I think a lot of people either don't know this or like, break that down.
Yeah, I mean, so from my understanding, I had an exhibition called For the Record, and it was a history of DJs and sound systems. And we had some videos, award-winning videos, and these videos were, they were owned by Bell Media. They some of them were supported by Music Factor, not Factor, Music Fact. There's a Munch Music funding body. You had to apply to. Videos would cost anywhere between $5,000 to $10,000 to make one video, and then, you know, you didn't have the rights to it. So the director that I was working with, shout out to David, he you know, he did a couple of videos. He did something for Mishimi that won an award. He did something for Socrates. He did Money or Love for Socrates. And when we were getting this exhibition together, we had to get permission from Bell Media to show the videos that he won awards on. Which means if it doesn't end up on YouTube somehow, so luckily lots of people are putting it up on YouTube, then artists could not have access to their own music video
That's
if
right.
Bell Media says they cannot.
And some of those songs were never pressed on vinyl, or they were only released as videos.
Yeah. So there's that, and you know, even if they go up on YouTube, there's no guarantee that they won't disappear one day off of YouTube. So there's that whole piece around, you know, what you know, for people that are using digital platforms today, getting a music video was like getting your music distributed.
Yes.
It was a goal. It was a massive goal to, you know, go down and have Master T basically certify you, you know, give you the ropes, help professionalize you, and get your music video on rotation. And that was a big deal. And now, you know, without only with the people that are like have their VHS rip and their Rap City logos on their little videos, those are sometimes the only publicly circulating copies of these videos. Mm-hmm. You know, the other thing I should also mention was there was with Blogspot. I wish I could find this dude. There was a guy that was digitizing and posting all of the college radio shows. So at one point in Toronto, you know, you could find a hip hop radio show twice a day on 5 different stations, all live, open format, DJ mixed. And it was a moment. And then that platform also disappeared too. And all of those copies of those shows, because people will just throw out those cassettes, right? That's right. All of those disappeared, you know?
Yeah. The last thing on this that I wanted to bring up is sampling and cases like what we've seen with De La Soul, right? Where important music to the culture might not be able to exist on streaming platforms or downloading platforms because of sample issues, and you know what that might mean. What are your thoughts on that? I think that would be a growing problem, because I think that it's going to become easier and easier for rights holders to be able to identify uncleared samples, and that will cause more and more music to be pulled down.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, because rights holders largely, when they're large corporations, they just weaponize their IP. Yes. And they will write an algorithm to find whatever they want to find. And the problem with that is that there's no respect for hip hop culture, in that the inventiveness, the creativity that we spoke about, there's no respect for the art form of sampling, of chopping a sample, of getting the tightest kind of loop. And because there's not a recognition of that, they will just unleash and scour the internet and clean up, you know, like take a whole bunch of things down. And I find that as that's going to be a growing concern, you know, just the way that many websites are and folks, you know, platforms are organizing themselves to be read by AI machines and AI bots. They want to make their knowledge graph legible, and they want people to discover their content. And, you know, I don't think that's good for everyone. Yes. You know, some of the best records I have are white labels, unreleased stuff. I have stuff that, you know, I would, if it was circulating on the internet, and a great example is Talib Kweli had a song called Lonely People.
Okay.
Yeah, sampled All the Lonely People. The illest song you could imagine. If that was on the internet now, it would be taken down somehow. Yes. If the rights holders wanted to pay some kid to write an algorithm to rip it down. And that, to me, was one of, you know, for me, one of Talib's top 5 songs, you know. But there is definitely a friction there, because hip hop has never been a kind of culture that was, you know, deeply aligned with institutions. You know, we're always doing something different. And the way that things are moving, it's concerning how much control rights holders can develop in scouring the internet for material to enforce their IP.
I think about that a lot for my own catalog, but, you know, just in general, and for the history of the music, you know. And I think what it does come down to is with sampling, with hip hop's contribution in that way specifically, hip hop turned everything into an instrument. Turned every sound into an instrument. that is a lasting contribution to music, if it's allowed to be a contribution to music.
Yeah.
You know, I think the way the music industry was designed, it's almost like they forgot that pianos are just technology. A guitar is just technology. You don't pay a royalty to the guy who invented the guitar every time you play the guitar.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, the creativity of, you know, if you listen to Little Richard play the piano,
yeah,
that man's playing the piano like a percussive instrument. He's not playing the piano for its melodies. He's playing that piano hard, like it's a drum, you know? And for me, that's part of the creative genius that Black folks bring to hip hop, that gets lost in all of the minutia of who owns what and how to enforce one's catalog. It's kind of frustrating, but it still remains unresolved. So like at this very moment, we can think about Black creative labor as always extracted and circulated by platforms and then made profitable for those platforms. Yes. You know? And we could easily see the whole TikTok scenario. What should we be doing differently as young Black creatives, as artists, when the relations of production haven't changed though? Exploitation is exploitation, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat. They always seem to find a way to make profitable and commoditize these levels of creativity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have any answers, but I'll tell you something that occurred to me in the weeks after George Floyd was murdered, and there was that blackout on social media, right?
Yeah.
And it was a day for only Black voices on Instagram. And the thought that occurred to me was like, this should be the other way around. There should be a day where we don't participate in these platforms because of everything that we give to them.
Yeah.
And we take the power back in that way.
Yeah.
Because, these 4 or 5 companies, they're everything, right? In terms of they are the tech industry, and there's just 4 or 5 companies, and we make them every time.
Yeah. And it's part of, I used to think we should just stop doing this. Yeah. And at some point you could see that it was life, and it is life. The creativity is how we create life under all of the most brutal conditions. But these arrangements haven't changed from plantation days till now. So every time, if we were singing songs in the field, somehow those songs became recorded spirituals somewhere else, So I was hoping that you had, a way for us to detach ourselves from the attention economy, and a way for us to not give up too much of ourselves while still trying to, but I love your suggestion,
Yeah, really understanding we deserve a much bigger stake in these things, in TikTok, et cetera, because but I think the challenge that we run into at every turn is, comes down almost to the concept of ownership, and how it's like, to a creative person, it doesn't really make sense. And to creative people, it doesn't really make sense. It's not in our culture. It's not in our, it's not in our brains as creative people to think about the world that way and to think about ideas that way, because it's just not true, right? Ideas are always iterations, and they're always shared, and they're always, and creativity is not something that you can, that lawyers can draw a clear box around. So that will always be, I think, the problem that we run into fundamentally, is we don't think in these terms around creativity, like ownership, that because they don't make sense, because they're not the proper way to look at it.
It's also just the most recent way. When you think about the creative industries and industry, people have been telling stories for thousands of years.
Yes.
If someone said, I can't tell you the story because such and such owns the copyright, we would lose the circulation of information and knowledge that got us to where we are today.
That's it.
As a civilization, or as multiple civilizations, So I hear you totally around that the wiring thing. That's actually, you know, part of the argument of Creative Commons is that, you know, once you legislatively close down the possibilities to create new work on top of other work, you actually destroy creativity. If you feel like you can't tell that story, could you imagine, you know, being an MC and saying, I'm not allowed, Coca-Cola won't allow me to say that.
And that's my thing with sampling is you're saying no using new instruments.
Yeah.
No using new instruments. I know you have the capability to turn any sound that exists into an instrument. You're not allowed. You have to use these instruments that we've decided are public domain. They're called the piano and the guitar and the drum kit. It's absurd.
Yeah.
If there's anything that might fix it, you know, transparency. Right, that's always been a tool of the music industry to control and to keep the profits, you know, in the hands of few, is making it unnecessarily opaque.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about Spotify refusing to tell people their algorithm, I mean, that's all you really need to know in terms of the whole streaming world. Why? It's not like, you know, 90% of the people in the world can't build an algorithm to destroy Spotify's algorithm. So why not share that with people? Why not give us an idea if you're doing things ethically, right? Why not do that, you know?
I've always felt that way with the music business. Like, this should not be a complicated business.
Yeah.
This should not be a complicated business. If I can't understand it, there's a problem.
Yeah. And it's necessarily made opaque, you know, not just with the legalese language, with all of these sort of clauses and backdoor escape hatches to recoup money from artists that are barely, you know, making tons of money. So I want to focus now, Shad, we haven't really talked about you as an artist. We have all these great ideas and I love this, but I'm not gonna, our audiences want to know more about Shad K. So can we focus a little bit on you as a, I'm going to say, thoughtful rapper? Cool. I won't say, you know, and how just being yourself gets you large audiences of people that like rap. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm thinking here how your imagery and your lyricism, it doesn't reinforce mainstream anti-Blackness, violence, misogyny, hypermasculinity. All of that's not part of your image, but somehow you still find success. How do you feel about the way that you're received and your audiences and what you're allowed to do?
Yeah, I feel fortunate that I came up in, I mean, we've been talking about the downsides of the mid 2000s and in terms of archiving and stuff, but I really feel fortunate to have come up in a time where the independent music, the independent movement in hip hop was kind of picking up steam, and there were these avenues to start a career kind of on your own terms. There wasn't quite as much pressure to conform. If you could get out there and prove that what you do resonates, then you can participate in the industry a little bit more, right? So that's how it worked for me. You know, I was able to make my first album on my own and promote that on MySpace, which was not a thing that was possible just a couple years prior, but tap into a whole community of people that liked independent music, promote my own shows, sell my own CDs at stores. I mean, at shows. That whole little window in time for independent artists allowed me to kind of be myself and prove that it works.
Okay.
Right? My first album or two. Yeah, and you know, that's always just been my mentality with hip hop. I'll tell one anecdote because this was really what taught me everything I needed to know about how I should approach making music. Was my first battle. Oh. And so growing up, when I grew up, late 90s, learning from Cannabis and Black Thought and all the super lyrical, miracle, spiritual, I came at this dude with all of my metaphors and everything.
Yeah.
And then he said something and like made fun of my hat, and I lost. The whole crowd was dying laughing, and I lost.
Yeah.
But I learned everything I needed to know from that experience, which is that it's all about the audience. It's all about the audience. He got them on his side, you know? So that shifted my thinking and made me go, okay, I got to use what I have, but not towards defeating my competition, not towards making myself look good, but towards winning their attention and engagement and enjoyment.
Yeah.
So that changed everything for me.
And now you can just be yourself.
So that was like, now I need to really be myself, but be myself like towards the audience, like use everything I got to win them over.
Okay.
And I can't focus on this next man here. I can't try to like do his style or whatever. That's not what I have. So sorry, this is like a long answer to your question.
Oh, no.
But you know, all of that, basically all of those experiences are what taught me how to be myself, you know, as an artist. And in terms of the audience that I got doing that, that was a surprise to me. Because I got a lot of fans that I wouldn't have expected, you know, people that don't necessarily know much about hip hop or don't necessarily like understand everything I'm saying. But what I learned is that people they hear something deeper in your music than just the lyrics or the beats. Sometimes they just hear something that they either like or don't like. Yeah. So some of my fans I'll relate to a lot and others I won't. But there's just something they've chosen to like.
So what did you see in your new album? Yeah. You know, you do a little bit of work with George Elliott Clarke, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, and you know, an English professor. Do you feel like you got new audiences that are sort of looking at you differently by teaming up with this well-known professor? Like,
yeah, maybe.
Do they see your lyricism as literature now?
I don't think so. I don't think. I still don't think, even with you know, Kendrick getting the whatever Pulitzer and all that, I still don't think people understand what we do with language.
Yeah.
I don't think they understand.
Like someone like George Elliott Clarke understands as someone who studies language and words. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
He understands. And I was so glad to get him on that track, you know, and do some connecting of styles and traditions, you know.
Yeah.
He absolutely gets
a poet for all of our audience members. He performs as a poet too, in addition to being a professor. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah. Very knowledgeable, very eloquent poet. But yes, I still don't think people really understand what we do with language in hip hop. I think it's the most technically sophisticated poetry ever in the English language.
Oh yeah,
by far. But I still don't think it's fully, you know, even with Hamilton and you know everything, I still don't think people get it. This is what we do all the time.
I think people would get it if they were on stage in a freestyle battle and had to figure out the connection between words and cadence and rhythm and get it out in 20 seconds. Maybe that would give them a chance to understand. So I'm not going to belabor this because it's esoteric to many, and we can't explain genius over the phone in an hour, over the Zoom in an hour. So I'm going to quickly, we have 10 minutes left and we have a bunch of questions, but before we get to those questions, I definitely have to pose this one to you. Yes. Okay. If there were 3 things that would remain in your archive for your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews to access, what would these 3 objects be? And what would those 3 objects reveal about you or your career in the year 2051, 30 years from now?
That is so hard, because like I said, when I started, it was CDs and MySpace. By the next album, it was YouTube and digital downloads.
Yeah.
2 albums later, it was streams. And so, you know, what would be the significant things? I would have a record on vinyl. Probably, yeah, my latest album, let's say, on vinyl.
Blue. It's blue. I love it.
Blue, yes. I would probably include that, just because that is, first of all, there's something about, you know, that a record, something tangible, but also the connection to the roots of hip hop. Look, this is where it started. It started with records, and this is a record. So I would have that. I would be tempted to say my Juno Award, but there's no guarantee that matters in 2051, right? Like, industry awards, who's to say? But I'd be tempted to say that. At least there is a history. I don't know when the Juno started, but, you know, it's part of a tradition, even if that tradition ends.
Yeah.
And then a third piece, Hip Hop Evolution, although I've never seen a hard copy.
Perfect answer. We hope there'll be a hard copy one day to go somewhere. That's amazing. Amazing.
I've never seen a hard copy.
So we have 4 questions in the chat, and I'm gonna pose them off to you here. So the first one comes from Boston, from Murray Foreman. Can you describe the background/homework process that went into the Evolution episodes? Who made up the research team? What on the ground work happened before the film crew landed? How were program decisions made? Who to talk to, where to focus the narrative, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to give as much of that as I can. So the directors of the series were Darby Wheeler and Rodrigo Baskunin. So they were at the helm in terms of developing the story and, you know, deciding how that should look visually as well. Researchers included Susanna Ferreira, Del Cowie, Amani, Celine. I'm trying to remember all the researchers that were involved, but some really great journalists, writers, researchers. The story, plotting the stories got harder and harder. So in the beginning, there's a lot of texts about, you know, the beginning of hip hop, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, etc. Like there's a certain accepted, or a few accepted stories and few people involved. You can talk to the few people that were there at ground zero. As the music expanded, it became harder and harder to try to tell a story that made sense. So I know that the directors thought about it a couple different ways. One, firstly, we thought of our show as an overview. So at a certain point, you can't say everything. Like it can't be comprehensive, and you can't try to be comprehensive. It's impossible. So that was one way of looking at it. Another rule that the directors had was they didn't want, and we got some pushback from the broadcasters about this, but they didn't want anybody who wasn't there talking about the story. So if it's native tongues, no Drake talking about native tongues. I know that that's good for ratings.
Yeah. How about Jerobi? Jerobi, could he?
Jerobi could.
Jerobi could, okay.
Jerobi's, that's fine. We'll, you know, but, you know, the broadcasters would want that. Of course, they want J. Cole to talk about Public Enemy, but it's like from a storytelling standpoint, just to make the story come alive, but also just from a accuracy standpoint.
Yeah.
The directors wanted the people that were there to tell the story as much as possible, with, of course, like scholars and experts to fill in the gaps, but none of that stuff that broadcasters like, of Jay-Z talking about the Beastie Boys. It's like, he wasn't there when they made Paul's Boutique. We don't want, we don't want that. So those were a couple different ways that we approached making telling the stories, and then there's, of course, who we can get, right, to be interviewed, because it's not a very engaging story when you're just talking around the central figures. It's obviously better when they're there. So that affected some decisions as well, is who can we talk to. We always had producers on the ground in the different places as well. We always had somebody local. Yeah, that's about as much as I can say as far as a process. And it was obviously different city to city as well. Yeah.
Now, Murray has a follow-up question. In your encounters with the pioneers, was there ever a sense that their status as pioneers weighed heavy on them? That it was at all difficult for them to carry the responsibility of having forged a culture and carrying out its values?
That's a really good question. I didn't get that sense, but I did get the sense from many, which is totally fair, that they didn't get to benefit as much as they should, right? Because like you were saying, in the early days, no one was thinking about recording. I remember it was even illuminating for me when we talked to KRS-One, and he said when he had put out South Bronx, he was still sleeping on the train. Wow. Like, that's like a classic record to us now, but back then hip hop was just wasn't a big thing, wasn't a big moneymaker. So and that's him, let alone the real pioneers from the 70s that never got to make a record, or when they did, it was a little too late. Some of them were too good, actually.
Yeah.
Because when hip hop started to be recorded, it was like, obviously on the heels of Rapper's Delight, it was a certain sound that the real pioneers were beyond. They were beyond that.
Yeah.
To them, that was whack, and they're like, I can't do that. That's trash. To them, right? They'd evolved too much already. So I got that sense from some of the pioneers, but I didn't quite get a sense that it weighed on them carrying the history. I didn't totally get that sense. They seemed pretty happy to tell the story, and yeah.
Okay, 2 more questions. We just reached 7 o'clock. Another question this is from Kira. With so much time between the album release and the supporting tour, I'm getting curious about what the live show will be like on May 6th in Ottawa, May 6th, 2020 in Ottawa. Anything you can share about how you are designing the look and the feel of shows coming up, and the upcoming tour?
I have no firm plans. The only thing that is on my mind right now is just like really connecting with people. I'm just excited for that. I don't know what that's going to look like. Q&A. I don't know. I just really want to have an experience with people because I miss that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Holy smokes. It's gonna feel amazing, and it's gonna feel odd at the same time, probably, just to be back around people and doing your thing.
Yeah.
Nicole has a question. Nicole's an MA student at OISE in Toronto, and she loved the piece around. Her question's long, so I'm just gonna jump right through it. She loved this story about technology and how it's she's working with technology as a kind of pedagogy for her work that's around resisting violence among Desi women in Toronto. The question is, she wants to know if you have any suggestions for how to follow this thread of this focus on technology as it is connected to social change, but also where to go to find more on sources on women and how we articulate our bodies in rap music. I noticed women only got one episode on Hip Hop Evolution so far. And there's a couple emoji facey things going on there.
Yes. Somebody in the chat probably knows this, but I think it was ABC News that recently did a Women in Hip Hop special. Kira says she'll send the link. So that will probably be your best, most up-to-date resource on that. And what was the first part of the question?
The first part was just trying to figure out how to, literature that would help her understand the focus on technology as it's related to social change.
As it relates to social change. I don't have any resources off the top of my head. Even my my learnings about technology in hip hop aren't super explicit in the show. It's just something that I picked up that I never really focused on. For some reason, I never thought of hip hop as electronic music.
Yeah.
I don't know why. I just didn't. I think again, because I'm coming from the word side, the storytelling, I thought of it as folk music.
Yeah.
But it's electronic music. It's the frontier of music technology always. So that was something that I learned. I don't even think our show makes it super, super explicit. So yeah, I don't have any resources off the top of my head. Thanks,
Shad. Nicole, I don't have a resource for you on rap music, but if you check out Tara Rogers' Pink Noise, it's a whole book on women and technology, music technology. There might be something on rap in there. That's a super narrow focus, but there's also lots of work on women DJs. So there's something out there around technology and women. So thank you for that question, Nicole. And there was a part 2 to that question that I missed. It's a little bit longer. She says that I can't read the second part of the question because now the first part of the question has disappeared. So we are, I'm hoping that if there's any other questions, now would be the time to drop them in the chat. We have about 5 minutes left, folks. And I know there's other events happening for House of Paint tonight. Well, tomorrow will be the closing out of day 2, and there'll be some live music with DJ Celestial. So check the chat if you want to get up on Twitch and see what's going on there. Shad, did you have any last words you wanted to share with this audience? It's been a wonderful time. We rarely get moments like this just to build about the actual culture,
Yes. I've just appreciated this, Mark, and I've heard about your work for a long time and just really appreciate your work, your thoughtfulness in this conversation. And so just great to bump heads with you and connect. And big up House of Paint. I've been connected with House of Paint for a long time, and Ottawa hip hop. I have long history with Ottawa hip hop too. So yeah, it's a lot of love. Thank you, everybody.
Well, Shad, I want to thank you from hip hop heads across Canada, from hip hop heads everywhere, because you represent us well. And you, not only do you do an amazing job, and the journalists have recognized, but coming from a self-proclaimed hip hop nerd, thank you for doing the work that you do. You're helping us move the culture along. You're helping us preserve the culture. And I'm glad you were able to take some time out to chat with us today. And I'm so thankful that House of Paint created this platform for us. So shout out to the Knowledge Conference.
No doubt.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both so much. This was a very insightful conversation. I'm going to put a few links in the chat for extra credit. I feel like everyone still here is a little bit of a hip hop nerd. So I'm going to link the book that Mark co-edited. It is called We Still Out Here, Hip Hop North of the 49th Parallel. I just ordered a copy. It should be here in 2 to 3 weeks. I had to special order it. So I'll give you a link to get that from Octopus Books, which is a local bookseller, but check out your preferred bookseller to get your copy. We did put the link in the chat for Shad's tour next year. He'll be coming through Ottawa May 6th at Club Saw. I'll also post the link for the Canada Land episode where Jesse Brown interviews Shad as well as the director. And you mentioned his name, I believe it was one of the writers and researchers. So you can get a more holistic view of the research process that went into the evolution of hip hop. And I'm going to link Northside Hip Hop Archive as well. One of my favorite things on that site right now is the archive of hip hop flyers from the GTA in Toronto going back as far as the 80s. So do your homework, folks.
Man, it's all there.
Yes, thank you both again so much. We'll see you on Twitch in about an hour with Life Boogie. And Shad, Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.